The wind started talking at 3:47 in the afternoon. Not howling, not whistling. Talking. A low, grinding voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the frozen ground and up through the soles of Elijah Thorne's boots. He'd never heard anything like it. None of them had. Then someone screamed the word that emptied every mind of every other thought. Tornado. In December, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In weather that should have been too cold for such things to exist. But there it was, a column of spinning darkness dropping from clouds that had turned the color of a bruise, touching down 3 miles west and coming fast, coming impossibly fast. Elijah ran for his round cabin. Behind him, he heard his neighbors running too, for their square cabins, their normal cabins, their cabins with corners and flat walls and peaked roofs that had always been good enough before. 60 seconds later, those cabins would be kindling. 4 months earlier, September 1894. The boys building a barrel. Samuel Crawford said it loud enough for everyone at the trading post to hear. Loud enough for Elijah to hear too, though Crawford probably didn't care either way. The old farmer had been building square cabins for 40 years, and he'd never seen anyone do what the Thorne boy was doing now. Not a barrel, Jacob Hendricks corrected, squinting at the construction site across the clearing. Barrels got flat ends. That thing's round all the way through. Like a damn silo, Crawford finished. A silo with a door. Boy's building himself a grain storage and planning to live in it. The men laughed. Even Father Williams, who usually kept himself above such mockery, allowed himself a smile. The Thorne boy had been strange since his parents died. Everyone knew that. Spent too much time alone, reading books that had no pictures, drawing shapes that had no corners. But this, building a circular cabin in a land where every structure had been square since the first settlers arrived, this was something new. Elijah heard the laughter. He kept bending logs. That was the hardest part, the bending. Square cabins used straight logs because straight logs were easy. You cut them, you stacked them, you notched the corners. Done. A child could understand it. A child could probably build one, given enough time. But round walls required curved wood, and curved wood required steam and patience, and a knowledge of grain structure that most builders never bothered to learn. Elijah had spent 3 weeks constructing his steam box alone, a long wooden chamber where he could heat logs until they became flexible, then bend them around a circular frame before they cooled and hardened into their new shape. Why? His neighbor Thomas Reed asked one afternoon, watching Elijah wrestle another steamed log into the bending frame. Reed wasn't mocking. He was genuinely curious, which made him unusual among the settlement's men. Why go through all this trouble when straight walls work fine? Elijah wiped sweat from his forehead despite the autumn chill. You ever watch water flow around a river stone? Sure. It doesn't stop, doesn't pile up, just goes around. Smooth, easy. Elijah patted the curved log he'd just secured. Wind does the same thing. Square walls, wind hits them flat, pushes against them, tries to knock them down. Round walls, wind just slides past. Nothing to push against, nothing to grab. Reed considered this. We don't get much wind up here. Nothing that would knock down a proper cabin. Not yet, Elijah said. Reed laughed and walked away. But something in the boy's voice made him glance back at the sky before he did. By October, the cabin was half finished, and the settlement had developed a new game, finding ways to describe Elijah's creation. The drum, some called it, the cheese wheel, the pregnant grain silo. The kindest description came from old Martha Briggs, who had been alive long enough to see things most people had forgotten. Looks like the roundhouses my grandmother described. The old people built them, back before everyone decided corners were civilized. She was the only one who didn't laugh. Martha came to visit the construction site one afternoon when the others were busy with harvest work. She walked around the half-finished structure 3 times, running her wrinkled fingers along the curved logs, nodding to herself as if confirming something she'd long suspected. My grandmother lived in one of these, she told Elijah. In Ireland, before she came over. Said they built them round because the fairies couldn't hide in corners. She smiled at the memory. That's what she told me anyway. I think the real reason was simpler. What was the real reason? Same reason you're building this one. Round things last, square things break. She patted the curved wall. You figured that out from books. My grandmother's people figured it out from 1,000 years of watching storms tear through villages. Elijah showed her his grandfather's engineering diagrams, pages of calculations showing how force distributed across curved surfaces versus flat ones. Martha couldn't read the mathematics, but she understood the drawings. That's exactly what my grandmother described. Wind hits a flat wall like a fist. Wind hits a round wall like... She searched for the right word. Like water against a river stone. No impact. Just flow. The books call it laminar flow, Elijah offered. The old people called it common sense. Martha laughed, a dry, papery sound. But common sense isn't common. When everyone's been doing things wrong for so long, they've forgotten there was ever another way. She visited 3 more times before the snow came, watching the walls rise, asking questions that showed she understood more about construction than most of the men who mocked it. On her last visit, she brought a gift, a small iron charm shaped like a circle. My grandmother's, she said, for luck, though I suspect you won't need luck. You've got something better. What's that? Geometry. The round door was the final challenge. Square doors were simple, straight cuts, right angles, hinges that attached to flat surfaces. Round doors required curved cuts that followed a perfect circle, frames that bent without breaking, hinges that could swing on a curved axis. Elijah spent 2 weeks on the door alone, failing 4 times before succeeding on his 5th attempt. Why round? Thomas Reed asked, watching Elijah hang the finished door. The walls I understand, wind resistance. But a round door? What's that for? Elijah swung the door open and closed, watching how it moved. Consistency. A square door in a round wall creates a weak point. The corner of the frame doesn't flow into the curve. It interrupts it, creates stress concentrations. He shrugged. Probably wouldn't matter in normal weather, but if you're building for the worst weather imaginable, you don't leave weak points. Reed shook his head. You're building for weather that doesn't happen here. Not yet, Elijah said again. It became his catchphrase around the settlement, those 2 words. Whenever someone pointed out that his preparations were excessive, that his caution was unwarranted, that his round cabin was solving a problem that didn't exist, Elijah simply said, "Not yet," and kept working. The phrase annoyed some people. It worried others. And it lodged in everyone's memory, waiting for the day when "not yet" became now. November brought the first snow and the first real test of the settlement's patience. Winter preparation was serious business in the Blue Ridge. Wood to be chopped, food to be stored, gaps to be chinked against the coming cold. Everyone worked from dawn until exhaustion, focused on survival. Everyone except Elijah, who was still steaming logs and bending curves while his woodpile sat half-stacked and his food stores remained incomplete. "He'll freeze," Crawford predicted at the trading post. "That round thing of his. How's he going to heat it? No corners to hold the warmth. No flat walls to put a fireplace against. Heat'll just spin around and around until it flies out the chimney." "Boy doesn't have a chimney yet," Hendricks observed. "Just a hole in that pointy roof. Even better, he'll freeze twice as fast." What they didn't know, what Elijah hadn't bothered to explain, was that the round shape was actually better for heating. No corners meant no cold spots where chill air could accumulate. The curved walls created natural circulation patterns that distributed warmth evenly throughout the space, and the central fire pit, positioned directly under the roof's peak, sent heat radiating outward in every direction equally. By December 1st, Elijah's round cabin was maintaining 65 degrees, with half the firewood his neighbors were burning. He didn't mention this at the trading post. He'd learned that explaining things to people who'd already decided you were foolish only made them more certain of their conclusion. December 14th, 1894. The morning started wrong. Elijah felt it before he understood it. A pressure in his ears, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the overcast sky. The birds had gone silent. The usual morning sounds of the forest, squirrels chattering, branches creaking, the distant rhythm of woodpeckers, all of it had stopped. The world was holding its breath. He stepped outside his round cabin and looked at the sky. The clouds had arranged themselves into patterns he'd never seen, long parallel lines stretching from horizon to horizon, as if someone had raked the heavens with enormous fingers. The light was wrong, too, filtering through the overcast with a greenish tint that made the snow look sick. His grandfather's books had described weather like this. Chapter 14. Atmospheric Conditions Preceding Severe Rotational Storms. Elijah had read that chapter a dozen times, but reading about green-tinted light was different from seeing it paint your world in colors that shouldn't exist. At the trading post, the older men noticed it too. "Feels like storm weather," Crawford said, though the sky showed no sign of the usual storm clouds. Wrong color for snow. Hendricks was staring west, where the horizon had taken on a greenish-yellow tint that none of them had seen before. Wrong color for anything. Father Williams closed his Bible, he'd been reading by the window, and joined them at the door. "My grandfather spoke of a storm in Tennessee, 1830, I believe. Sky turned that color before it hit." "Before what hit?" The priest didn't answer. He was already walking toward the church, moving faster than any of them had ever seen him move. At 3:47 p.m., the tornado touched down. Later, survivors would argue about what they'd seen. Some said it was black. Others swore it was green, or gray, or the color of nothing at all. What they agreed on was the size, a column of spinning wind 300 yards wide, tearing across the December landscape with a roar that sounded like every train in the world arriving at once. December tornadoes were supposed to be impossible in the mountains. The cold air, the terrain, the atmospheric conditions, everything that meteorologists would later understand said that this shouldn't happen, couldn't happen, had never happened before in recorded history. The tornado didn't care about meteorology. It carved a path straight through the heart of the settlement. Elijah was 200 yards from his cabin when he saw it coming. He ran, not toward the trading post, which was closer, not toward the church, which was sturdier, toward the round cabin that everyone had laughed at, because somewhere in his gut he knew that it was the only structure that might survive what was coming. Behind him, the world came apart. Crawford's cabin the one he'd built 40 years ago, the one he'd reinforced and expanded and maintained with the pride of a craftsman, lifted off its foundation as if a giant hand had simply picked it up. The logs separated in midair, spinning outward like spokes from a broken wheel, scattering across a quarter-mile of forest. Hendrix's barn exploded. That was the only word for it. One moment it was a barn, the next it was 1,000 pieces of wood traveling in 1,000 different directions at 60 miles per hour. The trading post, the church, the mill house. Elijah saw them all in his peripheral vision as he sprinted toward his cabin, saw walls peeling away like paper, saw roofs lifting off and flying, saw everything that was straight and square and normal, catching the wind like sails and tearing themselves to pieces. He reached his round door and dove inside. The sound was indescribable. Elijah pressed himself against the curved interior wall, hands over his ears, eyes squeezed shut, and listened to the tornado try to kill him. The wind screamed around the cabin's circular walls. He could hear it sliding past, frustrated, finding no edge to grip, no corner to catch, no flat surface to push against. His grandfather's books had described this, the aerodynamics of curved structures, how wind pressure distributed evenly across a round surface instead of concentrating on flat walls, how corners created turbulence that amplified force, while curves created laminar flow that dissipated it. Theory. It had all been theory. Now Elijah was inside the theory, and the theory was holding. The cabin shuddered. The door rattled in its round frame. The central fire scattered sparks across the floor. But the walls held, the roof held, the curved logs that everyone had mocked as impossible, impractical, pointless, they held. 47 seconds. That's how long the tornado took to pass directly over Elijah's cabin. 47 seconds of sound that would live in his nightmares for decades. Then silence. Elijah opened his eyes, uncovered his ears, stood on shaking legs, and walked to his round door. What he saw outside would stay with him for the rest of his life. The tornado had carved a path 300 yards wide through the settlement. Everything in that path was gone, not destroyed, not damaged, gone. The ground itself had been scraped clean, as if a giant razor had shaved the earth down to bare soil. Crawford's cabin, gone. Hendrix's barn, gone. The trading post, the church, the mill house, gone. 12 structures had stood in the tornado's path. 11 of them no longer existed. The 12th was a round cabin with a round door, standing untouched in the center of absolute destruction. The survivors emerged slowly. Not everyone had died. Some had been outside the tornado's path. Others had found shelter in root cellars or creek beds. But everyone who had been inside a square structure when the tornado hit was either dead or injured. Everyone. Crawford was alive. He'd been in his privy, which was far enough from the tornado's center to survive as a tilted wreck rather than scattered debris. He walked toward Elijah's cabin in a daze, blood running from a cut on his forehead, staring at the round walls as if seeing them for the first time. How? His voice was barely audible. How is it still standing? Elijah didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the destruction around him, at the lives erased, at the community shattered. It didn't feel like a moment for explanations, but Crawford deserved an answer. Corners, Elijah finally said. Wind hits a corner, and it multiplies, concentrates, all that force focusing on one point until something breaks. He touched the curved wall beside him. No corners here. Wind couldn't find anything to push against. Just slid around and kept going. Crawford stared at the wall, reached out and touched it himself, as if confirming it was real. 40 years, he said quietly. 40 years I've been building square cabins, telling everyone that's how it's done, laughing at anyone who tried different. You couldn't have known. I knew enough to laugh. Crawford's voice cracked. I knew enough to stand at the trading post and call you a fool while you were out here building the only structure that could survive what just happened. More survivors gathered around the round cabin as the afternoon faded toward evening. They came for shelter. Elijah's was the only intact structure for half a mile, but they stayed because they couldn't stop staring at it, couldn't stop walking around it, running their hands along the curved walls, trying to understand how something so strange had become the only thing still standing. Father Williams arrived at dusk, limping from an injury sustained when the church collapsed around him. He'd been in the root cellar beneath the altar when the tornado hit, the only reason he was alive. The old people knew, he said, looking at Elijah's cabin with something like wonder. My grandmother's grandmother talked about round buildings, said they were sacred, said God lived in circles, not squares. He shook his head. I thought it was superstition. It's geometry, Elijah said. Maybe those are the same thing. 23 people sheltered in Elijah's round cabin that night. 23 survivors pressed together in a space built for one, warmed by a central fire that distributed heat evenly in every direction because there were no corners to create cold spots. Outside, the temperature dropped to 15 below zero. Inside, it never fell below 55. The rebuilding started in spring. Not everyone adopted Elijah's design. Some people couldn't abandon a lifetime of square building knowledge, even after watching it fail so catastrophically. But enough did. Enough looked at the cleared path where the tornado had erased their homes and decided that different might be better than dead. Crawford was the first. The man who had laughed loudest became Elijah's first student, learning to steam logs and bend curves and build walls without corners. His new cabin took 3 times longer to construct than a square one would have. Worth it, he said when it was finished. Every extra hour. Worth it. The construction process became a community event. People who'd never built anything more complex than a fence came to watch Crawford and Elijah work, studying the steam boxes, the bending frames, the careful process of coaxing straight logs into curved walls. Some came to help. Others came to learn. A few came simply to witness, to confirm that what they'd seen during the tornado was real, that round walls really had survived what square walls couldn't. Old Martha Briggs came every day, sitting in a chair that Crawford had built for her, watching with eyes that held a century of memories. My grandmother would have loved this, she said one afternoon, watching steam rise from the bending box. She always said the old ways would come back, said the new ways were just a fashion, and fashion always fades. The old ways came back because 11 people died in square buildings, Elijah said. He wasn't trying to be harsh, just accurate. The old ways always come back for the same reason. Martha's voice was gentle. People forget, and then they remember. The forgetting costs lives. The remembering saves them. She paused. Your grandfather's books, they remembered for him. Most people don't have books. They have graves. By summer, 4 round cabins stood in the settlement. By the following year, 11. Word spread to neighboring communities, carried by survivors who'd seen the impossible, a tornado that destroyed everything except the structure everyone had mocked. Thomas Reed, who had asked, "Why round?" all those months ago, built the 3rd circular cabin in the settlement. His was smaller than Elijah's, but perfectly proportioned, with a round door that swung on curved hinges he'd forged himself. I kept thinking about what you said, Reed told Elijah the day he moved in. About building for weather that doesn't happen here. You weren't wrong. That weather didn't happen here. Until it did. He looked at his curved walls with something like affection. Now I build for weather that hasn't happened yet, because yet is just waiting. The thorn round became a recognized design throughout the Blue Ridge. Not common, round building would never be as easy as square building, but known, respected, understood. Architects from the university came to study the design in 1897, 3 years after the tornado. They measured angles and calculated stress distributions and wrote papers with titles like Indigenous Wisdom in Vernacular Architecture and Curved Wall Construction in Tornado-Prone Regions. They interviewed Elijah for hours, asking about his grandfather's books, his construction techniques, his intuitive understanding of wind, behavior. You essentially rediscovered principles that professional engineers are only beginning to formalize, one professor told him. Without formal training, without advanced mathematics, you built a structure that outperformed everything else in a major natural disaster. I had training, Elijah corrected. Just not the kind you recognize. I had my grandfather's books. I had my grandmother's stories. I had Martha Briggs telling me about Irish roundhouses. He shrugged. Different kind of education, but education nonetheless. The professor wrote that down too. Modern structural engineers would later calculate what Elijah had intuited from his grandfather's books, that a circular structure experiences approximately 40% less wind load than a rectangular structure of the same size. That curved walls distribute force across their entire surface, while flat walls concentrated at corners. That the absence of edges eliminates the turbulence effects that can amplify wind damage by factors of 3 or 4. But the engineers came later. First came a 17-year-old boy who bent logs into curves because he'd read that wind and water behave the same way, and he'd watched water flow around stones his entire life. The tornado of December 1894 killed 11 people in the Blue Ridge settlement. It destroyed 23 structures and caused damage that took years to fully repair. But it created something too, a legacy of round buildings that would save dozens of lives in the century that followed. Every curved wall was a lesson remembered. Every circular cabin was a memorial to the people who died in square ones. Elijah Thorne lived in his round cabin until 1952, when he died at the age of 75. By then, he'd built 37 circular structures across 4 states, trained over 100 apprentices in curved construction techniques, and earned a reputation as the finest wind-resistant builder in the Appalachian region. His original cabin still stands. The logs have weathered to silver gray, the roof has been replaced twice, and the round door has been rebuilt 3 times. But the walls remain, the same curved walls that a December tornado couldn't tear down, still standing after more than a century of mountain weather. Visitors sometimes ask the current owners why the cabin is round. The answer is always the same. Because corners catch the wind, and wind, given something to catch, will eventually win. But there's a longer answer too, for those who want to hear it. A story about a boy who read his grandfather's books, about neighbors who laughed at what they didn't understand, about a December day when the sky turned green and the impossible came spinning down from the clouds, about 47 seconds that changed everything, and about a round door that opened onto survival when every square door opened onto destruction.